Caleb Whitmore had paid property taxes on the same Nebraska farm for more than 60 years. Most years, the bill was somewhere around $5,000, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. So when an envelope arrived in January demanding $47,318, the 89-year-old farmer knew something was wrong before he had even finished reading the page. Cal first thought somebody had added a zero by mistake. Then he thought perhaps the bill belonged to another property owner. His daughter Susan checked the name, parcel number, and mailing address. All of them belonged to Cal. The county office checked the account and told the family that the number matched what was in the system. According to the county's digital map, Cal no longer appeared to own only the 146 acres his family had farmed for decades. The map showed his parcel stretching across more than 400 acres, including valuable ground near a new highway interchange. Cal had never bought that land. He had never farmed most of it. He had never even claimed it. His son Robert wanted to protect his father from penalties and began discussing ways to pay what they could while fighting the rest. Cal refused to sell real land to pay taxes on land he had never owned. Instead, he went into an old machine shed office and started looking for a folded paper map his father had stored there more than 50 years earlier. Cal remembered only one thing his father had once told him about that map. The fence on the east side of the farm was not the true property line. 3 days later, Cal found the old paper. One faded line on it would eventually remove more than $40,000 from his tax bill. But before the problem was finished, that same line would reveal that the county map had made a second mistake nobody in the Whitmore family knew existed. At 89, Cal was no longer running the farm the way he had when he was 50. His knees were stiff, his back bothered him after long hours, and his hands had lost some of their strength. But his mind was clear, and he still knew the farm better than anyone. He lived in the same modest farmhouse where he and his wife Mary had raised their children. Mary had died 8 years earlier, and since then Cal had slowly reduced the amount of work he did himself. A younger, neighboring farmer named Jake Nolan leased most of the crop ground. Jake was 34, careful with machinery, and had earned Cal's trust over several seasons. Cal still checked the fields, maintained fences around the home place, kept old farm records, and handled smaller jobs around the barn and machine shed. He did not need to operate a combine at midnight anymore to consider himself a farmer. The land was still part of his daily life, even if someone younger now planted and harvested most of it. The Whitmore property was not huge by modern farming standards. It was about 146 acres of crop ground, pasture, farm buildings, and the home place. Cal's father Arthur had bought the main portion in the late 1950s. More land was added later, but the boundaries had been stable for decades. Cal had paid tax bills on the property for so many years that he knew what a normal increase looked like. Taxes could rise, assessments could change, but a bill jumping from around $5,500 to more than $47,000 was not normal. Susan lived less than half an hour away and visited several times each week. She was 58 and had become the person most likely to help Cal with letters, insurance documents, and anything involving computers. Robert was 61 and lived farther away. He worked in financial management and approached problems through risk. When Susan sent him a photograph of the bill, he drove to the farm the next day. Robert's first concern was not whether Cal was right. He believed his father. His concern was what happened while they proved it. County tax deadlines did not disappear simply because a landowner disagreed with a bill. Penalties could be added. A lien could become a problem. Cal had valuable land, but like many farmers, most of his wealth was not sitting as cash in a bank account. $47,000 was money he did not want to remove from savings. At 89 years old, Robert began looking at practical options. They could pay part of the bill and appeal. They could arrange short-term financing. If necessary, they could sell 15 or 20 acres and remove the financial pressure completely. Cal rejected the last idea immediately. He had no problem selling land if a day came when the family truly wanted to sell it. What he refused to do was sell acreage before knowing why the county believed he owed $47,000. For Cal, the problem was simple. A tax bill might look official, but it was still based on information. If the information was wrong, selling land to satisfy the number would not make sense. Robert considered his father stubborn. Susan understood both sides. She wanted the bill solved without risking penalties, but she also knew Cal had spent his entire life understanding exactly where his farm began and ended. If he said more than 200 extra acres had appeared on the tax account, she wanted to see the map before they made any financial decision. 2 days later, Cal, Susan, and Robert went to the county office. The assessor, Megan Price, was 47 and had worked with farm property for years. She did not dismiss Cal, but she also could not simply reduce a $47,000 bill because an elderly farmer said the map was wrong. She opened the county's digital property system and pulled up Cal's parcel. The mistake became visible immediately. The colored outline that was supposed to show Whitmore property extended far beyond the farm Cal recognized. The home place was there. So were the crop fields Jake leased. But the digital boundary continued east and then north, picking up large pieces of neighboring agricultural ground. A long section reached toward the new highway interchange, several miles away. The system showed slightly more than 400 acres associated with the Whitmore parcel. Cal stared at the screen. He knew several of the fields inside that outline. They had belonged to other families for decades. One had been sold to an investment group. Another had once belonged to a farmer named Warren Mills. Cal had never owned any of them. Megan checked the tax account, assessment history, and parcel geometry. From the computer's point of view, everything was working correctly. The acreage in the map matched the acreage being valued. Part of the mapped property had recently received a much higher assessment because land around the new highway interchange was beginning to attract commercial interest. The computer had taken the parcel it was given, applied the new value, and calculated the tax. That explained why the bill had suddenly exploded. The mapping problem had likely existed quietly before the current year. When the extra land was valued mainly as agricultural ground, the error was much less visible. Then the highway project changed what part of the land was considered worth. A line that had been wrong for years suddenly became extremely expensive. Cal asked why nobody had noticed that one farmer appeared to gain hundreds of acres without a deed. Megan explained that digital mapping systems could inherit old errors. Parcel lines had been converted from older records, aerial photographs, paper maps, and survey information over many years. The digital GIS layer was useful, but it was not the same thing as a legal survey. The county still needed evidence before changing it. Megan told the family what would matter. They needed the recorded deed, the legal land description, any historical surveys, and preferably confirmation from a licensed surveyor. If there was an old physical survey monument still in place, that could help. She also agreed to flag the bill as disputed so the family had time to provide evidence without the normal process moving forward as if Cal had simply refused to pay. For the first time since opening the envelope, Robert relaxed slightly. There was a process. But Cal was thinking about something else Megan had said. A physical survey monument. He remembered his father. Arthur Whitmore had been the kind of farmer who saved things other people threw away. Old receipts, equipment manuals, deed copies, crop records, and maps stayed in metal boxes or desk drawers long after everyone believed they were useful. When Cal was young, that habit annoyed him. Arthur could spend an hour explaining why an old drainage ditch mattered or why a fence had been built several feet from a legal line. One memory returned clearly. Arthur had once pointed toward the east side of the property and explained that the fence people saw was not exactly the legal boundary. The real line followed an older surveyed course connected to a drainage channel. The fence had been placed where it was easier to maintain. Neighbors understood that at the time, so nobody worried much about it. Cal had not thought about that conversation in decades. Back at the farm, Susan began pulling documents from the metal deed box in Cal's bedroom closet. They found the current deed, old tax receipts, insurance descriptions, and several farm maps. Every reliable document showed roughly the same thing. Around 146 acres, nothing close to 400. That was useful, but Cal wanted the older map. The machine shed had a small office built into one corner. It had never been a real business office. It was a room with an old desk, filing cabinet, shelves, a chair, and years of farm papers. Dust covered the top of the cabinets. Some drawers held tractor manuals. Others contained receipts from equipment Cal no longer owned. Susan and Cal spent most of the afternoon searching. They found a property tax receipt from the early 1970s. The acreage on it matched what Cal remembered. They found an old aerial photograph showing the farm before several drainage improvements had been made. They found handwritten notes from Arthur describing tile lines and pasture repairs. One note mentioned the east drain. That made Cal more certain the old map had existed. His grandson Luke joined the search the following morning. Luke was 27 and had always enjoyed listening to Cal talk about the farm's history. He did not farm full-time, but he understood equipment and had helped Cal digitize some family photographs. He began sorting papers by date while Susan checked the filing cabinet. Near the back of the old desk was a narrow drawer that had swollen from years of moisture. It barely opened. Luke pulled harder, and the drawer finally moved. Behind old machinery receipts and a faded county road booklet was a large yellowed envelope folded in half. Inside was a 1972 survey and plat copy. Cal recognized it immediately. The paper was worn at the folds. Several marks had been made in pencil. Arthur's handwriting appeared in the margin. The map showed the Whitmore farm, neighboring parcels, a road, a drainage feature, and a boundary line that did not match what Cal had seen on Megan's computer. The most important part was a short notation near the east side. The property boundary followed an old drainage line and surveyed course rather than the farm fence that had later become the most visible feature on aerial photographs. Susan placed the old paper beside a printed copy of the modern county map. The difference was obvious. The digital boundary appeared to follow a fence line for part of the distance, then continued across ground that the 1972 map placed in another parcel. Robert remained cautious. An old paper map was helpful, but it did not automatically prove the modern system wrong. Land could have been sold. Boundaries could have changed. Deeds could have been updated after 1972. Cal agreed. They needed more. The problem was that the old drainage channel, shown on the map, barely existed anymore. Decades earlier, parts of it had been filled and redirected to improve drainage. Trees had grown. Fence lines had changed. A person standing there today could not simply follow the old watercourse. Then Cal remembered another part of his father's explanation. Near the old east line, close to a group of cottonwood trees, there had been an iron survey pin. Arthur had shown it to him when Cal was young. Cal could not remember the exact distance from the road. He only remembered the cottonwoods and that the marker was close to where the ground began dropping toward the old drain. Most of those trees were gone now. Still, Cal wanted to look. Luke drove him out in the pickup. The January ground was hard in places and muddy where the sun had softened it. Dead grass covered the edges of the field. Old fence posts leaned at different angles. Luke brought a metal detector and a long probing rod. Cal carried a copy of the old plat inside a clear plastic sleeve. They started near the remains of an old cottonwood line. The first metal signal was rusted wire. The second was part of an old hinge. Then, they found a broken piece of farm machinery buried under several inches of dirt. Cal began wondering whether his memory was wrong. He had been a young man when his father showed him the marker. More than 60 years had passed. Trees had died. Soil had moved. Roads had changed. Luke kept searching. Cal used the plat to estimate where the drainage line would once have crossed. He remembered that the old fence made a slight turn near that point. They moved farther south. The detector gave another strong signal. Luke dug. At first, all he found was dark soil and a piece of stone. Then the shovel touched metal that did not move. They cleared more dirt. An old iron pin was still there. It was rusted, buried, and easy to miss, but it stood where Cal's memory and the old map suggested it should. For Cal, finding it felt like proof. Legally, it was only another piece of evidence. The family called Daniel Reeves, a 52-year-old licensed land surveyor who had worked on rural properties throughout the county. Daniel made clear from the beginning that he would not simply confirm Cal's preferred line. His job was to reconstruct the boundary from the legal records. He collected the Whitmore deed, the 1972 survey, section information, adjoining deeds, county records, and any earlier surveys he could locate. He inspected the iron marker Luke had found and compared it with other monuments in the area. He used modern survey equipment to establish positions, but he also worked backward through old written descriptions. The process took several days. Cal wanted the answer immediately. Survey work did not move that way. Daniel found that the deed description had remained surprisingly consistent over the decades. The property had not secretly expanded through a later purchase. No document supported the county's 400-acre outline. The old fence was the source of part of the confusion. At some point during conversion to digital mapping, the visible fence had been used as a convenient line. From there, another parcel layer had been joined incorrectly, and later updates repeated the shape instead of rebuilding it from the underlying deed descriptions. One wrong line had been copied into another map. Then that map had been copied into a newer system. For years, the error had sat quietly. Daniel's survey confirmed the first major answer. The Whitmore farm contained about 146.2 acres, not 409. The valuable strip near the highway interchange was almost entirely outside Cal's legal property. The $47,000 tax bill had been calculated from land Cal did not own. When Daniel explained that result, Robert believed the worst part of the problem was over. Cal did too. They were both wrong. Daniel had continued surveying the entire home tract, instead of stopping once he proved the county had added too much land. On the western side, near the barn, machine lane, and well area, another discrepancy appeared. This time the county map had done the opposite. Instead of giving Cal land that was not his, it had taken away land that was. The difference was around 7.4 acres. On the digital map, those acres were shown inside the neighboring parcel. On the recorded deed and survey, they belonged to Whitmore Farm. At first, Cal was less worried about 7 acres than about the hundreds that had created the giant tax bill. Then Daniel showed him where those 7 acres were. Part of the machine lane crossed them. Ground close to the barn crossed them. A section near an old well and access route was included. Most importantly, the strip created a practical connection toward the county road. Cal had been using that area for decades, without anyone challenging him, because everyone nearby treated it as part of Whitmore Farm. The digital map had been wrong, but daily farm use had hidden the problem. That might have continued for many more years, if not for the new highway project. The neighboring parcel had recently been purchased by a land investment company interested in future commercial storage and service development. Nothing had been built yet, but a preliminary access concept showed a road entering through the area, the digital map assigned to that company. According to Daniel's survey, part of the proposed access crossed Cal's legal 7.4 acres. The tax mistake had just become a property access problem. Susan immediately wondered whether the company had been trying to take the land. Daniel saw no evidence of that. Their planners had used the same digital information everyone else could see. If the county GIS showed the boundary in one place, a company preparing early plans might reasonably begin there. That did not make the digital line legally correct. Cal almost laughed at the situation. The county system was charging him taxes on hundreds of acres he did not own, while showing someone else as owner of land beside his own barn. One map had made both mistakes. Daniel completed a stamped survey showing the reconstructed legal boundary. The original monuments, the old drainage reference, and the 7.4-acre discrepancy. Cal, Susan, and Robert returned to Megan's office with a much larger folder than they carried the first time. This time, they had the recorded deed, the 1972 survey, historical tax records, photographs of the discovered monument, and Daniel's professional survey. Megan reviewed the material and sent it through the county's formal correction process. She did not argue once the evidence became clear. In fact, she was concerned about how far the error had spread, because correcting Cal's parcel could require adjustments to several adjoining digital boundaries. The county traced the likely problem back to an older mapping conversion. A visible fence line had been treated as if it were the legal boundary. Later, digital parcel geometry inherited that decision. Another connection to neighboring land was then carried forward. When valuation around the highway changed, the mistake suddenly produced a tax number large enough for somebody to notice. Megan placed the disputed assessment on hold while the correction was processed. Cal did not have to pay $47,000 first and hope for a refund later. That mattered to Robert, who had spent weeks worrying about deadlines. After the revised acreage and classification were entered, the new tax calculation came back. The bill was a little over $5,600, very close to what Cal had expected before opening the original envelope. More than $40,000 had disappeared from the bill. Not because Cal had received a special exemption, not because anyone had forgiven his taxes. The county had simply stopped taxing him for property he did not own. Robert looked at the new amount and thought about his first idea of selling acreage. If Cal had accepted that suggestion quickly, the family might have sold actual Whitmore land to pay taxes created by hundreds of acres that belonged to somebody else. That bothered him more than the original bill. It also changed the way he viewed his father's refusal. At first, Robert had seen an 89-year-old man resisting the safest financial option because of attachment to land. Now he understood that Cal had been asking a basic question everyone else had almost skipped. What exactly was he being charged for? The 7.4-acre problem still had to be resolved in the county records and with the neighboring land company. The company hired its own survey review. Their legal team compared Daniel's work with the deeds. They reached the same conclusion. The preliminary access road crossed land the company did not own. There was no dramatic courtroom fight. No angry developer arrived at Cal's farmhouse. The company simply had a practical problem. Their preferred road connection was no longer available in the form they had planned. They could redesign it entirely, or ask Cal whether he would consider an easement. Cal was not against development simply because he was old. He understood that roads changed, businesses arrived, and land around highways often became something different from what farmers remembered. What he cared about was choice. If the company wanted to cross his property, it needed to ask. That was completely different from a digital map making the decision without him. After reviewing alternatives, the company approached the family about a narrow access easement farther from the barn, and Cal, Robert, and Susan studied the proposal. Daniel reviewed it too. The route would not cut through the machine lane or interfere seriously with the remaining farm operation. Cal agreed to negotiate. The company paid fair value for the easement and covered the survey and legal work associated with it. Cal did not become wealthy from the agreement. He also did not block the project simply to prove a point. The outcome mattered because the corrected boundary gave him the right to decide what happened to his land. For Cal, that was the real issue from the beginning. The strange tax bill had brought back memories of his father that he had not thought about in years. Arthur Whitmore had farmed in a different time. Property lines were described with section numbers, bearings, monuments, roads, streams, and sometimes landmarks that later disappeared. Neighbors often knew where lines were, even when fences did not sit exactly on them. Drainage channels moved, trees died, fence posts were replaced, roads widened. Arthur kept maps because he understood that physical things could change while legal descriptions remained. Cal had spent most of his life assuming that modern records made those problems less important. In many ways they did. Digital maps were faster. They were easier to view. They made assessment and planning much more efficient. But efficiency could also copy a mistake very quickly. A wrong line on one paper map might affect one office. A wrong line inside a digital system could appear in tax records, planning maps, property searches, and development documents all at once. The computer had not decided to overcharge an old farmer. It had done exactly what the information told it to do. The problem was the information. Months after opening the $47,000 bill, Cal sat at his kitchen table with Luke. The corrected county parcel map was open on a laptop. Beside it lay the old 1972 paper survey. The two lines now matched much more closely. Luke helped scan the old documents so the family would have digital copies. They saved the deed, Daniel's survey, the historic plat, photographs of the iron marker, and the county correction paperwork. Cal insisted they also keep the originals. He had learned enough not to trust only one form of record. Susan organized the paper documents into a new folder. Robert made copies for the family. Luke saved files in more than one place. The same family that had almost been forced into a rushed financial decision now understood its boundaries better than it had in decades. Jake Nolan continued farming the leased crop ground. The next spring looked ordinary from the road. Tractors moved through the fields. Cal checked fences. The barn still stood where it always had. The 7-acre strip did not suddenly look more important because a survey proved ownership. That was part of what made property line mistakes dangerous. Land did not change appearance when a database changed. The same grass grew, the same road remained, the same fence stood, only the line inside the record moved. Cal received the corrected tax bill and paid it normally. There was no ceremony. He wrote the payment, kept the receipt, and placed a copy inside the metal document box with the old survey. The original $47,000 bill went there too. He did not keep it because he was angry. He kept it because he wanted Luke to remember what had happened. A number printed on official paper could look final. A colored line on a computer screen could look exact. Neither one removed the need to understand the land underneath them. Robert later admitted that his first instinct had been to solve the money problem before understanding the property problem. That instinct made sense in his world. When a bill arrived, he looked for the fastest, safe way to protect the family from penalties. Cal had looked at it differently. He had spent 60 years walking the same ground. When a bill told him he owned land he had never crossed with a tractor, the amount did not matter until the acreage made sense. Neither man had been foolish. They were simply solving different problems. The strange part was that Cal's slower question turned out to be the faster path to the truth. The county also reviewed adjoining parcels after correcting Whitmore Farm. Some boundaries required minor adjustments. Most did not create major tax changes. The large highway-related valuation had made Cal's case unusually expensive. Megan used the situation as a reason to review how older parcel conversions were checked when major valuation changes occurred. She had never intended to overtax Cal. She had trusted a map that had been used for years. Cal never treated her like an enemy. That mattered to him. The county had made a mistake, but mistakes were different from dishonesty. Once the evidence was clear, Megan helped correct it. Daniel's role mattered for the same reason. Cal's memory had pointed the family toward the truth, but memory alone could not define a legal boundary. The old plat helped, the iron pin helped, the deed helped. The final answer came from putting all of them together through a proper survey. That made the ending less dramatic than a story about an old farmer defeating the government. It also made it more important. Cal had not beaten anybody. He had proven where his farm actually was. At 89, he found himself thinking again about the afternoon when Arthur first showed him the old boundary. Cal had been young and impatient. Property lines seemed boring compared with machinery and crops. Arthur had explained that the fence was there because it was useful, not because it was legally perfect. Cal remembered nodding without caring much. More than 60 years later, that small lesson had protected the farm. The fence had survived longer than the drainage channel. The drainage channel had changed. The cottonwoods had mostly disappeared. The iron marker had been buried. The county map had been redrawn. But the legal history had left enough pieces behind for someone willing to look. Cal also thought about what might have happened if he had been 10 years older, less alert, or more afraid of challenging the bill. He might have assumed the county knew more than he did. He might have borrowed money or sold ground. His children might have solved the immediate financial problem without ever discovering the missing 7 acres. That did not make Cal special. It made record-keeping important. The farm had survived because several generations had kept things that looked useless until the day they were not. Arthur kept the old plat. Cal kept the deeds. Mary had labeled folders carefully. Susan knew where to search. Luke was willing to spend hours in frozen grass, looking for an iron pin almost nobody remembered. Daniel knew how to connect old evidence with modern surveying. Megan was willing to reopen a digital record once professional proof arrived. The solution belonged to all of them. The highway project continued. The commercial access was moved onto the agreed route. Cal received payment for the easement and used part of it to repair a section of the machine shed roof that had needed work for several years. He kept the rest in savings. He did not celebrate the easement as a victory over development. He simply appreciated that the decision had been his. That was what ownership meant to him. Not that land could never change, not that nobody else could ever use it. It meant knowing where the line was and having the right to say yes or no when someone wanted to cross it. By the following winter, the story of Cal's $47,000 bill had spread around the county. Some people simplified it. They said the county had tried to tax an old man out of his farm. Others said Cal had found hundreds of hidden acres. Neither version was true. The county had not tried to take his farm. Cal had not discovered secret land. A boundary had been copied incorrectly years earlier. That wrong line had been repeated until a highway project made the error expensive enough to notice. The same mistake had also placed part of Cal's real property inside someone else's digital parcel. The truth was less dramatic than the rumors, but it was more useful. A map can be wrong. A fence can be wrong. Even a tax bill, calculated perfectly, can be wrong if the land underneath the calculation is wrong. Late one afternoon, Luke drove Cal along the edge of the Whitmore property. The old iron marker had been cleaned and documented, but they did not turn it into a monument or put a large sign beside it. It remained what it had always been, a small piece of metal in the ground, marking something most people would never notice. Cal looked toward the fields his father had once farmed, and the highway construction visible farther away. The world around the farm had changed enormously since Arthur bought the ground. Machinery had changed. Roads had changed. Land prices had changed. Computers had changed the way counties stored information. But one thing had not changed. Someone still had to know what belonged where. At 89, Cal Whitmore did not defeat the county, and the county had not been trying to take his farm. A line had been copied incorrectly years earlier, and repeated by a digital system, until new development made the error impossible to ignore. What looked like a $47,000 tax problem had really been a boundary problem waiting quietly for years. Cal's father had understood something long before digital maps existed. Fences could move, water could move, trees could disappear, maps could be copied wrong. What mattered was understanding the records that defined the land. The county computer had calculated Cal's tax correctly. It had simply been given the wrong farm.